and welcome to the 2021 IFS Green Budget. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the IFS, and it's my huge pleasure to introduce this event. We are, as you can see, doing it online only on this occasion, though all of the speakers are here with me, or at least all bar one of the speakers are here with me at the IFS. We're going to do this, first of all, we were going to start with Christian Schulz of Citi speaking about the world economy. We've got a couple of technical issues about connecting him, so he'll come later on. So instead we will, the first speaker will be Ben Nabarro from Citi talking about the UK economy, then we'll have Isabel Stockton from the IFS talking about the public finances, and then Ben Zaranko from the IFS talking about public spending. But before we move on to the main event, as it were, we have delighted to have Mark Franks of the Nuffield Foundation, to whom we're incredibly grateful for their funding for this work and event, and Andrew Pitt from Citi, who's made our collaboration with their great team of economists possible. The IFS Green Budget, of course, is something we try to do every year before the budget. This is actually the first year in the last three when we've timed it right, because the budget is occurring when it's supposed to. And I think for us the big story of this year is that we've had the biggest tax rises in a quarter of a century, taking tax levels and spending levels to records, or at least records in the last 40 years or so, and yet we still foresee real issues and problems for the Chancellor as he moves into his spending review. But I'll leave that story for my colleagues. The various presenters will present one after the other, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. You should all have a link to the Slido app where you can put your questions. You won't see me again until all of the speakers have finished, and at that point we will take whatever questions you have. I'll hand over to Mark Franks at this point.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the IFS for giving me the opportunity to explain why we're so pleased to welcome this year's Green Budget. The Nuffield Foundation is an independent charitable trust with a mission to advance social well-being. We fund and support rigorous research and analysis which has the potential to change people's lives for the better. We want the research we fund to ensure the development of economic and social policy is underpinned by fact rather than conjecture. At the same time, we recognise that the challenges facing society can't always be addressed by simply following the evidence. Policymakers often face difficult trade-offs, even where robust evidence exists. This is one reason why we are a long-standing partner of the IFS. It's an organisation that's transformed the way that economics and fiscal policy is debated in the UK. The IFS also recognises that key policy decisions are rarely simple and easy, but that it's vital that such decisions are based on the best evidence available. The Nuffield Foundation has supported the Green Budget for a number of years, yet every Green Budget seems, at the time, to be more important than all the others. Paradoxical perhaps, but the context for this year's Green Budget is dominated by huge challenges posed by the COVID-19 recovery, Brexit and the transition to net zero. So as we approach a vital budget and spending review, surely few would disagree that this Green Budget really does matter. The comprehensive nature of the Green Budget aids public understanding of the interrelationships between different areas of economic policy, as well as demonstrating why the issues it covers are important. Indeed, over the past few months, early output from the Green Budget has already provided valuable analysis of some of the systemic challenges facing the UK economy in the coming months and years. It has shown the risk of further growth to already lengthening NHS waiting lists. It has demonstrated that the end of furlough won't be felt equally across all generations and all parts of the UK. It has highlighted the current lack of a coherent framework to ensure that the costs of climate change are borne fairly across society. And last week, Green Budget analysis showed that the recently announced health and social care levy leaves fundamental questions unanswered as to how some of the most vulnerable members of our society will be able to access the care they need in the future. As I said a moment ago, it would be wrong to assume that it is simple or easy for policymakers to address these issues, and the others set out in today's report. But the Green Budget adds huge value to the consideration of such questions, while also enabling the government's own account to be held up to scrutiny. In its framing of the economic outlook, the IFS shows ultimately the questions to be addressed about people's well-being individually and collectively in a time of economic uncertainty. These issues are central to the Nuffield Foundation's work to understand the pathways to a more just and inclusive society. We extend our thanks to the IFS and to co-contributors Citi for once again providing such a comprehensive, timely and authoritative report. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you also, Paul, and good morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Pitt. I'm Global Head of Research at Citi. We're absolutely delighted to be collaborating with the IFS, again, on the production of the Green Budget this year. This is our 4th year of collaboration, and I hope there will be many more years of collaboration to come in the future. I think a number of us here in London were hoping that perhaps we could hold this meeting with an in-person audience today. Obviously, we're in still a transition of how these sort of meetings work best for audiences. If I think back to the last Green Budget that was presented in person, it was at Senate House in 2019. We had a packed room. And that seems a pretty distant memory. And I think it's a pretty distant memory, not just because of the memory of a physical gathering, but I think more important because of the profound changes that have taken place in the last 2 years. And not all of them because of the coronavirus pandemic. Indeed, while the pandemic itself has left UK public borrowing at record peacetime levels and created multiple tension points in the economy, the UK economy is still grappling with the aftershocks of Brexit. Healthcare, social care, and addressing the consequences of climate change also add substantial challenges to the Treasury and to public policy, and I think Mark's already alluded to that in his opening comments as well. And to echo what Mark said, I think the high-quality, independent analysis of the IFS is more important than ever in helping us chart a path forward through these very choppy economic waters. Citi's economists have provided 2 very substantial chapters to this year's Green Budget. The aim in our partnership has been the same as in the previous few years, which is to complement the IFS work with global and macroeconomic perspectives. And I would particularly like to thank my 2 colleagues, Dr. Christian Schulz and Ben Nabarro from our economics team at Citi, for their detailed work in compiling this year's chapters for the Green Budget. I hope you find them interesting reading. I think they are very important reading for all of us concerned about the health of the UK economy, and particularly the UK in a global context. Our first chapter in the report this year looks at the global economic outlook. And you will hear at some point, as Paul mentioned, from Christian. I think we were having a few problems getting him dialed in from Frankfurt. Ben is here in the room, and you'll hear from him straight after me on the UK economy, where we've clearly witnessed a sharp but very much incomplete rebound. And alongside Brexit-related disruption, we do believe the UK economy will go through some very profound readjustments over the next decade, which also will become the subject of some further work that hopefully we're doing with Paul and the team here on Britain, Brexit, and the COVID chapter added to Brexit as well. So I'd just like to finish by thanking the IFS for allowing us to collaborate. I'd also like to thank Mark and his colleague Tim Garden at the Nuffield Foundation for their fantastic support of research and intellectual rigour in the UK. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague Ben, who will now take us through the UK.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew, and good morning to you all. As Andrew mentioned, I'm planning here to talk through the UK economic outlook. And here, the key point of departure really is that the UK has enjoyed a very rapid rebound since the start of 2021. But as Andrew alluded to, this is neither secure, and reflecting this, it remains highly compositionally uneven. Now, the UK's economic recovery from coronavirus has proven more rapid than we had initially expected at the start of 2021. Initially, output fell by less in the first quarter than in previous lockdowns, reflecting continued economic adjustment. And then activity has since rebounded more strongly as restrictions have been lifted and the vaccination programme has enabled particularly a more complete easing of previous social distancing restrictions than we had formerly expected. However, the important point, we think, is that this faster rebound to date indicates little concerning the medium-term recovery. The rebound to date remains compositionally narrow, with both public and private consumption making up all of the marginal growth in the second quarter, and with as yet little evidence of a substantial increase in public investment or trade. And second, we also have started to see economic momentum fading really rather sharply as we've moved into the third quarter. GDP for July disappointed substantially, and while we expect a small re-acceleration in August, for now at least it does seem that consumer demand is not recovering or maintaining the momentum we might have hoped. Further, we think that the momentum over the winter is likely to prove relatively weak. In this case, we think the lingering pandemic is likely to cast a persistent shadow, and there we would reference particularly our work from last year that already showed that as case numbers remain elevated, we tend to see consumers react to that with voluntary social distancing rather than simply rather than just the mandated restrictions being that which drive economic activity. In addition, we remain of the view that the boost from accumulated savings is likely to prove only limited. And third, we think that while thus far incomes have been largely fully supported by fiscal policy since the beginning of the pandemic, with furlough and other income supports now being wound down, our expectation is that many firms and households will begin to feel the income effects of the pandemic for the first time. So all of this is simply to say that while we have enjoyed a sharp rebound, as Andrew alluded to, the recovery remains far from secure. No. Cool. Could we get the next slide, please? The important point of departure here, in terms of our economic outlook, is that the UK economy doesn't seem to be rebounding to its pre-pandemic form. Now, this clearly creates an economic challenge. The policy narrative to date has been one of tying firms and households over a period of acute pandemic-related disruption, bridging over troubled waters, if you like. The challenge, if the economy is not rebounding to its pre-pandemic form, is clearly that alone will not likely be sufficient to secure a robust and persistent recovery. Now, within the rebound to date, we continue to see evidence of lasting reconfiguration as a result of the pandemic. To point a few bits of evidence that we discuss in the chapter, among households, it does seem that the pivot away from social consumption is proving increasingly persistent, and we also note evidence of geographic reconfiguration in demand. For example, applications for primary school places for the school year 2021-2 were down 6.7% in central London. And clearly, while one may think that some of those people have left the country entirely, there is also a concern that, or rather evidence among firms, that we have seen demand not just shift across sectors, but indeed across regions as well. The data we flag, which I think is particularly interesting, is on the firm foundation side. These have proven relatively strong during the pandemic, but have remained highly compositionally uneven, with firm foundations, for example, in certain parts of the retail sector, 365% above where they were in 2019. All of this suggests to us that firms aren't just expecting a rather different economic expecting a different economic rebound compared to what we'd seen previously, but indeed are preparing for one as well. Next slide, please. Now, for the UK, the challenges here are not just as a result of the lasting impact of the pandemic, but indeed the result of Brexit as well. Now, while clearly this has been on the agenda for some time, we believe that the depreciation in sterling we saw in 2016 has created a strong impediment to reconfiguration. So while firms have, of course, ultimately expected market access to the EU to potentially suffer greater impediments, there has been a strong cost incentive to keep activity in the UK for quite some time. Now, what we've seen, we think, at the start of 2021 under the surface is some evidence that firms are beginning to grapple with the new Brexit reality. In particular, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side there of slide 12, you can see the concentration across different goods categories with respect to UK exports to both the EU in the light blue line and then to the rest of the world in the dark blue line. Why this is interesting is because clearly, while COVID has disrupted trade globally, Brexit is a more lasting change, and to the degree we've seen firms decide to concentrate on a narrower group of goods, and indeed we've also seen evidence that smaller firms are moving away from exporting in particular. That is consistent with the idea that firms expect a more lasting change in this area, and the sharp divergence only at the start of 2021 we think implies that firms are only beginning to grapple with this reality, something that will ultimately percolate through the domestic economy as income support is also wound down. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, these structural changes have important implications for the way one should think about the dynamics of the recovery. Of course, thanks, Ben. Of course, you know, in any recovery, you may well think there's a small amount of structural change, and structural kind of change is also something that's ubiquitous. It occurs gradually across economies almost at all times. The difficulty is the speed of reconfiguration in final demand that we've seen, particularly as the economy has reopened, where we have seen quite striking structural changes in the composition of what people and firms are demanding. And in addition, that's come alongside fiscal support that has frozen the supply side of the economy, and particularly the labour market in its pre-pandemic form. Now, this has had really important implications for particularly the labour market data we're continuing to see. Just this morning, we saw vacancies increase to a new record at over 1.1 million, but this comes even as furlough rates have remained stubbornly high through to the end of the scheme at the end of September. Now, this really reflects these contortions, this changing structure of final UK demand. And what that has done is essentially acted to create a contorted recovery rather than one that's necessarily strong or weak. For now, that's resulted in severe bottlenecks, tightness as the economy has reopened, and new areas of growing demand have come up against limited supply capacity. As we go into 2022, we expect the supply adjustment to many of these changes to begin to accelerate as we see fiscal support wound down and labour mobility gradually return. The implication of that for the UK labour market is that the current tightness and wage pressures which are now being observed, we think, especially in aggregate, will prove a temporary phenomenon. Instead, with GDP likely continuing to lag by about 4% compared to its pre-pandemic trajectory at the end of this year, our baseline expectation is for the labour market to ultimately soften and for a margin of spare capacity to emerge, particularly as we move into the first quarter of next year and firms refocus on profitability instead of pure market share. The implication is that we expect unemployment to increase to around about 5.5% at the beginning of the first quarter of next year. Reconfiguration, of course, implies some lasting matching challenges, and we do think that some of that increased unemployment will reflect structural matching issues rather than purely a cyclical weakness of demand. But that said, we still think both will play a role. And indeed, within the chapter, we explain that even if we do see more severe matching challenges than we currently expect in the UK labour market, we wouldn't usually expect that to drive a more persistent period of strong wage growth. Indeed, historically, while those sorts of events have tended to drive a small or short period of stronger wage growth than previously, these have tended to fade more quickly. So even if, you know, the matching issues in the UK labour market prove more severe, we wouldn't expect that to underpin a lasting period of strong wage growth nor strong inflation. Now, this all takes me rather neatly to the way we are thinking about UK inflation in the sort of 18 to 24 months ahead. Clearly, we have all seen UK price pressures pick up quite markedly as the economy has rebounded. And indeed, in our analysis for the Green Budget, we expect CPI inflation to increase to around about 4.6% in April next year. The recent moves in gas prices and wholesale electricity prices, if they were to be sustained, would likely see that peak increase to around about 5.5% in April next year. But the important point is we continue to think these effects are a lot more likely to prove transitory than not. There are three sets of factors that are driving UK inflation here. The first are things that we can be pretty sure are likely to be temporary. These are things like increases in household energy bills, some upward pressure on fuel prices, both of which we would expect to largely dissipate as we move into the end of next year and into 2023. There are a second category of factors which are more transitory and have the potential to be sticky. There, we're thinking particularly about imported inflation effects, global supply bottlenecks. Those, we think, also should begin to dissipate, with supply in many of these areas historically quite price elastic on a global basis. Of course, there is the potential, particularly with the end of just-in-time production techniques, for relative prices in these areas to remain permanently higher going forward. But again, we wouldn't expect this to be a persistent source of UK inflation. Instead, one has to focus on the domestic drivers. There we think this contorted recovery is currently leading many to worry, justifiably, that the supply impediments resulting from the end of the pandemic risk driving a more persistent increase in UK inflation. For now, that is not our baseline expectation. Things or aggregate supply conditions, such as, for example, the scale of the UK workforce, looks likely to have weathered the pandemic relatively well. And indeed, for now, while matching issues may drive some specific price pressures or wage pressures in certain sectors, it certainly wouldn't be our expectation, given the weakness in the GDP profile, that is likely to prove more sustained. Instead, we expect many of the sort of transitory price pressures that we have been observing in recent months to fall back relatively quickly through the second half of next year. And indeed, what many of the inflationary drivers we currently see, we think of as disinflationary inflation rather than inflationary. There, particularly things like increases in household energy bills don't tend to result in stronger wage growth in the UK, but instead tend to feed back into lower real household disposable incomes, further weighing on economic momentum. So that takes me last to two final questions. The first is, what lasting legacy is COVID likely to lead as far as the level of economic output? There, we have now significantly more optimistic than we might have been a few months ago with respect to the long-term supply impact of the pandemic. Reconfiguration does, of course, imply some capital scrapping, and overall we do expect a permanent GDP scarring as a result of COVID of around about 1.4%. That particularly reflects losses in areas such as commercial property, some transport infrastructure, but we do think that particularly on the sort of aggregate UK labour market side, other worries such as the scale of net migration or a permanent drop in participation, for now at least, don't look to have been as severe. However, the early evidence with respect to the scale of the Brexit impact does continue to show a pretty marked impact. And we would expect that over the forecast horizon, that will result in a further 1.1% hit to the level of GDP, over and above those numbers that were forecast by the OBR in March 2021. In essence, we think the impact is more severe, and as such, we expect total scarring compared to the previous fiscal trajectory of around 2.5%. Last, there is, of course, the question of what should policy do to try and manage these risks. Now, we personally believe that while UK policymakers are rightly recognising the upside risks to inflation expectations, which do pose a challenge as far as a risk of more persistent or entrenched inflation is concerned, we continue to believe that UK policy should err on the dovish or on the supportive side over the coming years. The key observation for us here is, with the economy reconfiguring, there is likely greater interdependence between the speed of the recovery and its overall scale. In that sense, prematurely tightening or taking away support for the recovery risks not just the sort of usual risk management concerns as far as getting stuck at what's called the effective lower bound, where you're stuck in a sort of sclerotic growth and weak inflation dynamic, but indeed also risks compounding the longer term impacts of COVID. And what we would say is, with 1.4%, our current scarring assumption, that is based on the hope that a relatively rapid rebound can limit hysteresis effects. If the recovery proves more complicated or even more protracted, that, of course, would be subject to downward revision. That's all from me. I will now pass to Isabel from the IFS.
Thanks very much, Ben. I'm now going to tell you a little bit about where the public finances stand today, what the outlook is like for the next few years, and highlight some of the challenges that are coming down the line. So, as Paul alluded to, we are finding ourselves in a situation where, under current plans, the tax burden, a measure of tax as a share of national income, is set to rise to 36%, which would be its highest sustained level since the early post-war period. This comes after a large tax-raising budget back in March, when the Chancellor announced a total of 28 billion of tax rises through a combination of income tax and corporation tax, followed by the announcement at the beginning of last month by the Prime Minister of another 14 billion of tax rises. Now, while the first was aiming at consolidating the public finances, the second is entirely spent and is aimed at addressing long-term challenges in healthcare and adult social care. Corresponding to this on the spending side, we have seen a large increase in the size of the state during the pandemic. This is falling back down to a more normal level, but nevertheless, there is going to be a permanent increase in the size of the state as we go forward. And we expect this measure, overall government spending as a share of national income, to settle at around 42% of national income. What does this mean for borrowing? Let's cast our minds back to the last financial year. So recall that the last official forecast at the March budget was made at the very end of that financial year. But even so, the outturn for borrowing in that year has since been revised down by £30 billion. And this just serves to highlight the amount of uncertainty that we're all living with still at the moment. Moving on to this year, under the central forecast in this year's Green Budget, we expect borrowing to come in more than 50 billion lower than was anticipated at the time of the March budget. This is through a combination of factors, most importantly, the improvement in the outlook for the nominal size of the economy that Ben highlighted. In addition, we expect a pattern that we've seen so far to continue of underspends on additional COVID budgets. This also improves borrowing. And these two factors are only very slightly countervailed by increased spending on debt interest. As we move forward through future forecast years, the improvement in the nominal outlook for the economy partly fades out, but some of the tax rises start working their way through the system. And in total, by the year 24-25, the last year for which we have an official pre-pandemic forecast, we expect borrowing to come in 21 billion below the March forecast, which would be slightly lower than expected pre-pandemic through a combination of both higher revenues and somewhat higher spending. One of the things we're expecting, in addition to new forecasts for the economy and the public finances in this autumn budget, is a report back from the Chancellor on the ongoing review of the fiscal rules. There appears to be a welcome consensus emerging around fiscal rules, with both major parties advocating a forward-looking rule on the current budget. So just to remind ourselves, the current budget deficit is the budget deficit excluding investment spending. This type of rule has many advantages. Because it excludes investment spending, it allows borrowing for investment that, if done well, will benefit future generations. And if it's a forward-looking target, so targeting not current budget balance in every period, but for example by the third or the fifth year of the forecast, it allows fiscal policy some time to respond gradually to shocks. Now, under the Green Budget forecast, we would expect current budget balance to be achieved somewhat earlier than under the forecast that the OBR presented back in March. So back in March, the forecast was for a small current budget deficit to persist all the way to the end of the forecast period, whereas under the central IFS Green Budget forecast, we would expect a small current budget surplus to be achieved by the year 23-24, which would then grow slightly more over the following 2 years of the forecast period. Now, on its own, a rule targeting the current budget does not place any limits on overall borrowing or on the trajectory for debt. So you might think that alongside this, you might want a fiscal target for a trajectory for debt. Now, a risk with a narrow focus on debt is that policymakers might lose sight of the asset side of the public sector balance sheet and might be inappropriately incentivized to sell off public sector assets to pay down debt or to not acquire them even when they would be better managed in the public sector. One solution to this would be to target a measure of public sector net worth. That would be the balance between all of the public sector's assets, physical and non-physical, and its liabilities. There are huge practical issues with measuring this, which would make such a target easily gameable and not very transparent. However, a focus on the asset side of the balance sheet alongside debt, as has been advocated for recently by both the Treasury and the opposition, would certainly be very welcome. Looking at debt over the next few years, under the pre-pandemic forecast, a measure of debt that excludes temporary interventions by the Bank of England was expected to remain largely stable. Post-pandemic, at the budget in March, this was revised to show a very large increase, followed by a stabilization in the later years of the forecast. Under our IFS Green Budget forecast, thanks to lower borrowing driven by an improvement in the economic outlook and large tax rises, we would expect debt to stabilize at a lower level than the OBR predicted back in March, and to start falling very gently in the final 2 years of the forecast. However, this would not be enough to put debt on a decisively falling path, and even at the end of the forecast period, in the middle of the decade, debt would be left 17 percentage points above its pre-pandemic level. Clearly, this is a very significant increase. However, to contextualize, it's worth reminding ourselves that this would be less than half as much of an increase as seen during and in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. One of the reasons why we might be concerned about high levels of debt is that it can be expensive to service that debt. Now, for years, and you'll have heard this in successive green budgets, this has been a largely theoretical concern. Indeed, in the last financial year, 2020-21, debt interest spending came in below the pre-pandemic forecast, despite a huge increase in debt to fund the COVID emergency response. However, things are changing. Since the beginning of the year, we've seen sharp increases in the yields on government bonds, alongside a fast increase in the rate of inflation as measured by the retail price index. Now, this matters for debt interest because a portion of UK government debt is index linked, which means that the payment made to service that debt directly depends on movements in the retail price index. In the central scenario that we've worked on with Citi, we expect these trends to continue. So for interest rates to remain higher than was thought back at the budget in March, and inflation to also be above the level forecast in March. And as a result of these things, we expect debt interest spending to be up by around 15 billion a year. Now, this is clearly a non-negligible additional cost. However, it's really important to stress that these increases in debt interest spending are really driven by an improved outlook for the economy and are therefore more than compensated for by higher revenues. So, for example, this year, we've got around a 14 billion increase in debt interest spending, but a 53 billion increase in revenues. So far so good, but we might be concerned that future increases in interest rates, if they persisted and were not accompanied by a similar improvement in the outlook for growth and for revenues, would not be as easy to bear. Now, taking a step back and looking beyond the immediate COVID recovery, there are known long-run fiscal pressures that have not gone away. Notably, the needs of an aging population, increased costs of providing healthcare and adult social care, and the investment needed for a transition to net zero by 2050 are all putting major pressure on the public finances. And these are not distant issues on the horizon that we don't need to worry about yet. These are coming up really soon. So even by the end of this decade, we might expect healthcare and adult social care to need an additional £28 billion. If we wanted to fund this exclusively through increases in the new health and social care levy, then it would need to more than double from 1.25% to 3.15% to fund this. In addition, there's a substantial direct fiscal impact of the net zero transition. This is made up in part by public sector investment to help sectors where it might be difficult to get appropriate investment exclusively through the private sector to transition, and in addition some erosion in tax bases such as fuel duty. And the combination of these two things might cost an additional 31 billion. Now, if all of these pressures were funded wholly through higher borrowing, then projected debt would be on a rising and indeed an accelerating path, and more tax rises might be needed. So to summarize, borrowing this year is down substantially by over £50 billion on the March forecast, but the improvement is much smaller in later years, though still substantial. This arises through a combination of higher debt interest spending, which is more than offset by greater revenues. The large planned tax rises coming down the line of around £40 billion would be sufficient to return to current budget balance by the third year of the forecast, and just about to get debt falling very gently. This is all under the central forecast. There's huge uncertainty around the outlook for growth and consequently for revenues. Under the optimistic scenario that Citi has presented, all of the tax rises from the March budget could be cancelled and we would still be on course for a current budget surplus. Under the pessimistic one, the tax rises from the March budget would have to be more than tripled to achieve the same aim. And finally, looking beyond the immediate COVID recovery, rising pressures on the public finances to fund healthcare, social care, and the transition to net zero are things that we shouldn't lose sight of. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Ben, who will tell you a little bit more about the backdrop to the upcoming spending review.
Thank you, Isabel. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining and sticking with us during a couple of technical blips. I'm now going to talk about the spending review, which is due to be held on the 27th of October, at which the Chancellor faces something of a dilemma. So, in March, he set out a set of spending plans, and he's since topped them up by £14 billion per year, alongside a manifesto-busting increase in national insurance, an increase in dividend taxes, and the creation of a new health and social care levy. Because of those spending top-ups, overall public service spending is now set to grow at a faster rate than what Gordon Brown's government was planning at the 2007 spending review, and he, a Conservative Chancellor, is set to preside over a lasting increase in the size of the state of around 2% of national income, and yet, despite all of that, he still faces a rather unpalatable set of decisions. So in this presentation, I'm going to take you through what some of those decisions are, why it still looks like a tricky situation for a Chancellor to be in, and what the implications of some of that might be. So first of all, I want to put some of this in context, and I'm going to show you here successive plans for departmental day-to-day spending. So that's spending on things like staff costs, on administering and delivering public services, and that's going to be the focus of my presentation today, because that's first of all where the bulk of the decisions will be, and it's also where the acute trade-offs will be. So if you look here, spending in cash terms in March 2017 and March 2018 was set to rise relatively slowly. They were topped up quite substantially in March 2019 following a bumper settlement for the NHS. They were topped up again after Boris Johnson entered Downing Street, and there was lots of spending announcements made. But those plans set out in March 2020 were rendered obsolete quite quickly because less than 2 weeks later the UK entered its first national lockdown. During the pandemic, the Chancellor pared back those plans a bit. He removed between 13 and 17 billion pounds per year from those plans, and what the recent top-up, announced just last month, does is takes us more or less back to what we were seeing pre-pandemic. But if you look to the end of the period there, you can see that despite the huge pressures and strains and disruption created by COVID-19, the Chancellor is planning to spend no more overall on public services than what he was back in March 2020. Another way to place the latest spending plans in context is to compare to previous spending reviews. So these have been in existence since 1998. And if we look here at what was planned at each spending review, you can see during the 2000s, under a Labour government, spending was planned to grow in excess of 4% per year at times, cut back quite sharply during the 2010s under the Coalition and Conservative governments. But then on the right-hand side there, you can see at the two latest, most recent spending reviews, both of which cover just a single financial year, spending was set to grow by around 4%. Now, the latest set of plans would see spending grow at an average real terms rate, so over and above inflation, of just over 3% per year. Now, that's not quite as generous as what we've seen in the last two. It's certainly more generous than what we saw in the 2010s, and in fact, it's actually more generous than what was planned at the 2007 spending review by Prime Minister Gordon Brown and Chancellor Alistair Darling. So spending is going to be rising overall, and indeed at a faster rate than we've often experienced in the past, which does beg the question, what's the problem? Well, first of all, the Chancellor's hands are largely tied by existing commitments that he's made to a number of areas. So the settlement for the Department of Health and Social Care has already been set, and that's about 40% of the pot next year. Schools have already had their budget set for next year, that's another 13%. The government has already laid out a settlement for the Ministry of Defence, and overseas aid spending will have to rise in line with the economy in order to remain at 0.5% of national income. So what that means is, when Rishi Sunak stands up on the 27th of October and holds his budget and spending review, about 2/3 of the pot's already been allocated, 2/3 of the decisions have already been made. He'll actually only be determining what happens to the remaining 36% or so. And what I'm going to show you now is that the scale of those commitments, combined with his overall plans, actually imply that some areas could be facing cuts. So I'm going to show you here how different areas of spending on day-to-day public services are set to evolve over the coming years. So overall, spending is set to grow by 3% and a bit a year, or 10% over and above inflation by the final year of the period. The health and social care budget is set to grow by more, by about 15%, although notice that that's very heavily front-loaded. The schools budget next year is set to rise by 5% in real terms, and we assume that will remain flat in the face of falling pupil numbers. The defence day-to-day budget is actually set to be cut back in real terms over the next few years, but that will be offset by a big increase in the defence capital or investment budget to spend on military equipment or space lasers or new ships or whatever it is that the defence budget goes on. The overseas aid budget will also grow in line with the economy by close to 9% on our central projection. And what that means for everything else is actually a cut next year of just over £2 billion, or about 2.5%. So those unprotected budgets include things like local government, further education, courts, prisons, the Crown Prosecution Service, HMRC, DEFRA, BEIS, lots of government departments that deliver very important services but aren't protected by existing commitments. Now, in the final year of the period, these plans actually imply a fairly generous settlement for those departments, so growth perhaps in excess of 8% because the health budget is set to flatline, defence budget is set to fall. But as I'll come back to in a moment, we might expect those plans to change somewhat. And so what they imply is a very difficult 2 years of unprotected budgets. And I want to focus now on just one of those, which is local government. So in some work as part of this year's Green Budget, which we published a week or two ago, some of my colleagues looked in detail at what the outlook looks like for councils in England and what their revenues and spending projections look like. So what we can do is produce a central projection of what how much revenue local governments will have under different assumptions about how much they raise council tax, and compare that to our central projections of how much money they'll need for services. And what you can see is if councils raise bills by 2% per year, that would leave quite a substantial funding gap, in excess of 3 billion next year, falling to about 1.5 billion in the final year. So that just wouldn't be enough for councils to meet all the pressures being placed upon them. If they were to increase council tax by 3.6% a year, that would be enough to close the gap by 2024-25, but still wouldn't be enough in the near term. Now, just to put that another way, the pressures facing local government are such that council tax increases of getting on for 4% a year are needed just to maintain pre-COVID, post-austerity levels of provision, and that still might not be enough to deal with the pressures that they face next year and the year after. So it really is a challenging and uncertain time for the local government sector. Another reason why the Chancellor will not have an easy time of it at this spending review is that he's got a set of very ambitious other domestic policy objectives, and delivering on things like levelling up, social care reform and net zero could all require billions of pounds of spending. And it's important to note that making real progress, particularly on levelling up and social care reform, could be difficult to reconcile with cuts to local government and cuts to further education and cuts to adult skills. So squaring that circle will be something that the Chancellor needs to worry about. And finally, the virus is likely to leave a legacy of funding pressures, not just for the NHS, which has now had a settlement intended to cover those pressures, but also for other public services which have been hit very hard by the disruption of the past 18 months. And as it stands, the Chancellor's spending plans actually make no allowance for COVID-related spending on other areas. So we've done some detailed work looking at what the pressures are on the NHS and what they might amount to over the coming years. You can find all the detail in our chapter online. But this is something of a summary. So we think that you're looking at about £9 billion of pressures next year, falling to 5 and a bit in the final year. Now, some of that is for the NHS itself, to deal with things like getting on top of the elective backlog and dealing with workforce pressures. Other parts are to deal with more of the direct virus response, like NHS Test and Trace, which is separate from NHS England itself. So we focus just on those purple bars there. We can compare our estimates of how much the NHS needs to how much was announced last month. And what you can see here, the yellow bars show what was announced on the 7th of September, is that the money that was announced, while it has a slightly different profile, looks like it ought to be broadly enough, or at least close to enough, to deal with the pressures facing the NHS. But in the final year, those plans imply little to no funding for COVID-related impacts. And that means that based on our projections, there could be something like a £5 billion shortfall in that year that might need to be made up either by cuts to other parts of the health budget or perhaps more likely through top-ups from the Chancellor. And I'll come back to that £5 billion number in a moment. But there'll be a legacy left beyond the NHS. So just to take a couple of these, this is not exhaustive. The OBR think that a package of catch-up for schools to help students recover from lost learning could add more than £1 billion each year. Compensating public transport providers for losses in passenger income could mean between 1 and 3 billion a year. We think that that's a £5 billion shortfall in that final year, but potentially it needs to be filled. And higher spending in England also means higher spending for the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland via the Barnett formula. So all that adds together to quite a hefty set of pandemic-related pressures that haven't yet been funded and what may need to be found from somewhere. So bringing all that together, what does that mean? Well, overall public service spending is set to grow. That's not in doubt, and we're not going to see a return to the full-throated austerity of the 2010s. We know that for sure. But despite that, despite those relatively generous overall plans, and despite the increase in the size of the state, some unprotected budgets are facing real terms cuts. And that could be very tricky to reconcile with a levelling up agenda and can have very difficult consequences for those services. Now, these plans do imply more funding for lots of those areas in the medium term, but you've got to ask the question of whether that funding will truly materialise. If some top-ups are needed for the NHS or for schools, or if he wants to fund some of those COVID pressures, that could very easily eat into the amount available for things like prisons, for courts, for local government. And so, just to illustrate this point, let's assume for a moment that we're right and that the NHS needs a £5 billion top-up in 2024-25. That could mean a very difficult 2 years becomes a difficult 3. So if the overall envelope is left unchanged, spending would still grow by 10% over the 3 years. The DHSC budget would grow by just over 18% rather than 15%, and you might look at that and think that looks like a more natural profile for health spending rather than flatlining in the final year. And that would mean that for everything else, those unprotected budgets, they'd grow by less than 3% over the 3 years, or less than 1% a year, and if top-ups were needed for something else, that could very easily become cuts for some areas, so it could be a tricky couple of years. Some final thoughts from me. The first is that, yes, lots of the big decisions have already been made, but there are still some important choices to do. Some of these relate to public sector pay, which has been an increasingly contentious issue in recent months and years. So last year, of course, the Chancellor froze the pay for millions of public sector workers. Now, there was some logic to that, but extending that freeze could pose challenges for recruitment and retention. And it's important to note that lots of public sector workers, particularly those who are more experienced or higher earning, actually earn considerably less than in the past. So NHS hospital consultants, for example, earn about 9% less than they did a decade ago. Dentists earn more like a quarter less than they used to. Experienced teachers earn 8% less than they used to in 2007. And we can see that across the board. And if you continue to freeze the pay of those workers, that could create some challenges. And there are questions about whether the funding provided to areas like net zero, levelling up and social care reform will actually match the rhetoric, and whether the Chancellor will be able to put his money where his mouth is and make some serious progress on getting towards those goals. But the big picture here is really that a lot of the challenges here come from the fact that health spending has grown and is growing to account for an ever-increasing share of the total. So we estimate that it could amount to 44% of overall public service spending by the middle of this decade, up from less than a third in 2010 and less than 30% at the turn of the millennium. And what that means is that decisions over the NHS budget, while of course important, are now increasingly driving how much money is available for other services and also overall government spending and fiscal policy. And as these well-established and well-known demographic pressures continue to grow, if the government isn't able to meet those pressures by making cuts elsewhere, it seems likely that tax rises rather than tax cuts might be the order of the day, and that the size of the state will also continue to increase. That's all from me, and I believe I'll now hand back to Paul, and we'll have time for some questions from the audience.
Right, let's go in that case to questions, and please do add some to the Slido app. We've got a few here, but given the amount that's been talked about, perhaps not as many as I'm sure there will be. So what question for you, Ben Nabarro. Could you expand on your point in your final slide that we may have to deal with more stagflationary shocks due to the transition? I mean, what is your concern about? I mean, are you concerned about stagflation?
I am. That relates particularly to this question of inflation expectations, which I think really is the key sort of inflation concern for us, at least from here, which is less that we see a sort of strong recovery and strong wage growth and all of those good things that you might think contribute to what's often described as a reflation, and instead we sort of see very high prices leading people to expect those sorts of rates of inflation to be persistent, and that of course can become more entrenched. The key question with respect to should we expect more of these kinds of shocks going forward really relates to whether you think future sort of volatility with respect to output is going to be driven by supply or demand. And the problem I think is especially facing the UK is with the ecological transition and several other, we're going to see the supply legacies of Brexit come through only very gradually. It's plausible that we see more volatility being driven by sort of changes in supply, changes in capacity, requiring the economy to adjust. And that means this compromise, this question of how you manage or support the economy through those sorts of reconfigurations becomes a much, much more poignant, important question for our policy institutions. And one of the things that certainly I think has been true in the way we talk about central banking, monetary policy, even cyclical fiscal policy to a degree, is it's all very much concentrated on this idea of demand-driven macroeconomic volatility. And potentially we're entering a period where we have to think about things just a little bit differently. And that, as I say, is really about the external disruption side and the ecological transition, which means in some respects COVID could be thought of as a little bit of a dress rehearsal. And it's one where comparatively the UK doesn't necessarily, dare I say it, compare particularly well at this point.
So in what way doesn't it compare well? What do you mean by that?
Well, in other economies, you can come to various views, and one of the things that's remarkable through the current pandemic is, different central banks at least have come to very different views as to the way they think about the current economic crisis. So the Federal Reserve, for example, is focused on what's called running the economy hot, sort of providing as much support as they can, and even as inflation overshoots, sort of saying, okay, but as long as we can ultimately get it back in the medium term, we don't mind too much about that. The Bank of England has taken a very different view. It's more sort of, if you like, conventional in the way it's interpreting its inflation targeting mandate. Now, those are two views where I'm not, especially given the greater risks to inflation expectations in the UK, I'm not willing to sort of say one or the other is necessarily right. But what I think is tricky in the UK's context, and why I say it doesn't necessarily compare particularly well, is I don't think there's a clear narrative as to what policy is trying to achieve, at least from the monetary policy side. I think there are questions, there's this question if you want to provide as much support as possible. There are worries about inflation expectations, but there isn't a clear narrative for the way policymakers think the recovery is developing. And if you're not communicating clearly, that's one of the big challenges of policy. And for now, at least, it doesn't feel to me, maybe unfairly, but it doesn't feel like there's that real narrative, that clarity about what policymakers think the risks are and how they're trying to manage them.
Well, I think that's a pretty fair complaint about what's happening at the moment. I rather suspect that people are getting too much sense that there's shortages of everything, when in fact it's just a few small but important parts of the economy, and that's the sort of thing that can feed unhelpful expectations. There's a series of other questions here. I mean, there's a question here, Ben Nabarro, about levelling up, but I think you can probably help explain what's happening here. The question is, what are the likely implications of UK-wide levelling up for ring-fencing finances that would have previously been allocated to the devolved administrations? Without taking your thunder, I think the answer is that, that there isn't a problem there, in the sense that everything will simply go through, as it always does, the Barnett formula.
I assume you mean Ben Zaranka rather than Ben Nabarro.
I did mean Ben Zaranka. Sorry, it's just too many Bens.
Jump in.
There are just too many Bens.
I think what that question might be alluding to is things like the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the funding that was previously spent on regional development by the European Union, which once now we've Brexited, we can take back control of, to coin a phrase. But I think what previously happened is that money was sent to, for example, to the Scottish Government to spend on Scottish development, where now the direction of travel seems to be that the UK Westminster Government wants to retain all of that and have those decisions made from Westminster. And I think there's a broader sort of trend here, really, is that a lot of the discussion about levelling up and a lot of the policy response, at least so far, we may start to see some future developments, has been around centralised pots of money sort of administrated and distributed by central government civil servants. And it's sort of part of that, and there really is a sort of tension at the heart of levelling up, where the central government wants to be able to spend things and have things to show for it and get credit for it, and so it wants to retain that central government control. But there's other people arguing that if you want to see more meaningful, lasting change, you might want to consider devolving some of that money and devolving some of that decision making to be made at a more local level. And that's true not just across different parts of the UK, but also within England. I hope that's what the question was alluding to in any case.
Well, that was a very good answer. So there's a question here which I'll take. The question is, if you were to take an educated guess, where will the Chancellor look to raise additional taxes? Do we need a raid on wealth? Well, if I was to take an educated guess, this Chancellor won't be raising any more taxes through this Parliament. Whether he'll still be Chancellor at the end of the next Parliament, when we might need an increase in taxes, is anybody's guess. So with the scale of tax increases we've seen announced this year, I think it's more likely that we'll see either some of those increases scaled back or some small cuts in the run-up to the next election than increases. But it seems almost inevitable that we'll get more tax rises by the end of the decade, or perhaps if governments manage to put it off a bit, early next decade, for all sorts of reasons, but mostly because of this increase in pressure from demographic change and the health service. But we'll also be losing, don't forget, an awful lot of fuel duty, for example, as we move to electric cars. Where will tax rises come from? Well, the best way to make an educated guess about the future is to look to the past. The most recent past has seen this increase, or this introduction of the health and social care levy, effectively an increase in national insurance contributions. Now that it's there, I would not be in the least bit surprised to see that rise over time, even though it's one of the least good ways, perhaps, well, that may be slightly harsh, certainly not one of the best ways of increasing taxes. Do we need a tax on wealth? Well, we certainly need to make the taxes on wealth that we currently have far, far better. Remember, we have a number of them council tax, out of date, regressive, not a very good way of fairly funding local authorities. Inheritance tax, pretty ineffective in terms of hitting the really wealthy. Capital gains tax, forgiven at death, and still at a lower rate than income tax for most. So there are plenty of ways of improving the taxation of wealth that we currently have, even before we think about additional taxes on wealth. There's a question here which sort of is related to the big story, Ben Zaranko, that we've been talking about, which is spending on health. And the question is a good one. Is public expenditure on health something common across Europe, or is there something particular to the politics of the UK?
Demographic pressures and rising health spending is not something specific to the UK. If we look at if we put the UK in sort of a league table of health spending, if you like, we're somewhere around the EU average. We spend more than lots of countries in Southern Europe, and we spend less than some countries in Scandinavia and countries like Germany and France, for example. All sorts of countries across the developed world are facing similar demographic pressures. The UK is sort of a different point in its demographic journey to other countries. So Italy, for example, is a bit further along, but all are facing similar pressures, and I think that it will be a challenge across all sorts of countries to sort of meet those pressures and how that's done. I think one thing that I think is important to bear in mind is that one way you might deal with higher pressures from the ageing population is to think about changing the offer that is available. Now, in countries, particularly in Southern Europe, there's much more of a culture and tradition of more informal care provision by family members, for example. And in countries like in Scandinavia and in Germany and places like that, it's often much more formalised care arrangements. And so one way, theoretically at least, if you want to remove some of the burden on the state, would be to shift towards more informal care provision. And indeed, Sajid Javid seems to have hinted towards that recently by saying that the first port of call should be family members, friends. It shouldn't be you immediately go to the state. So that's something that the government is thinking about, where different countries will have their own politics, history and other factors that, of course, go into these decisions. But this isn't something that only the UK is worried about, for sure.
Absolutely, the health spending is rising across the developed world, and it's something that all countries are struggling with, and some are actually struggling with pension costs rather more than we are. One for you, Isabel. Fantastic question. Do we think that fiscal rules should be based around fixed year or rolling targets?
So that's one way the economists actually have a clear answer, definitely rolling targets. So UK history of fiscal targets is littered with examples of rules that targeted a particular year. And you never know what might be happening in a particular year. You might have promised to bring the deficit down to zero in a particular year, and then a pandemic happens to hit, and you miss that target by several tens of billions of pounds. So we would always encourage a chancellor to think about a rolling target, a forward-looking target that would allow some time to respond to shocks gradually, to avoid making a crisis worse, and to provide some flexibility.
Absolutely, and I think one of the important aspects of this is that having an independent Office of Budget Responsibility makes that a much more credible thing to do than you would expect without such a thing. Clearly, rolling targets offer you the opportunity to continually roll things forward, but we have in the OBR, and without undue modesty, the IFS as well, we do have people keeping an eye on the Chancellor, and legally he has to take the OBR's forecast of where he's going to end up. Ben Nabarro, I think this probably refers to things the Prime Minister was saying last week. Is it likely that the skills shortage is going to contribute to a high wage economy?
It's a very good question. We think, or rather, there is a sense now where labour shortages or some of the bottlenecks we've seen as a result of the pandemic do seem to be concentrated in sectors that previously relied on European migration for their marginal worker. There hasn't been a large outflow of EU migrants, at least as far as we can see so far during the pandemic. What there has been is a sharp change in demand, and some sectors which previously, when they needed to expand, would have been able to bring over workers have struggled to do that, not just because of Brexit-related changes, but also clearly the pandemic as well. I mean, our sense is not that this will necessarily drive a lasting change in the scale to which firms invest and subsequently labour productivity can grow. You know, that's ultimately the only way you can get a high wage, high productivity economy. And of course, it's the case that if you have a shortage of labour, you could see a substitution of that sort of variety. But one of the difficulties, of course, is migration doesn't just act as a substitute sometimes for investment, but it can also very much act as a complement. You know, if you have a shortage of lorry drivers, Eddie Stobart isn't going to spend more on trucks. And similarly, it isn't the case that, even when there are shortages in that particular sector, that isn't an environment where you might expect manufacturers, service providers, all to be going out and investing much more in increasing their labour productivity. So, our sense is still that if you really want to see a lasting increase in sort of wage growth and move away from aspects of the UK's economic model of the last decade, you really have to do what you can to invest in skills, support that reconfiguration change, and in the process hopefully generate a more buoyant economy. I think it's certainly at best wishful thinking, and at worst, something that actually ends up being actively detrimental to your hope of trying to generate wage growth and improve living standards, just to hope that a couple of shortages or bottlenecks in specific sectors can ultimately drive a persistent sort of high productivity, high wage economy. I think that requires much more thoughtful and strategic interventions. And certainly I don't see anything in the current shortages that we see in the UK economy. There may be a bit of a revaluation of different skills, so white-collar workers like myself may be a little bit less valuable. People without potentially a tertiary education in certain sectors may be a bit more valuable. I might argue that's long overdue. That may happen, but actually the sort of robust growth, strong productivity sort of pivot, I think that will require more an active policy work to see that done.
Yeah, however much you might believe in the working of the market economy, and I think we broadly do, you're only going to transition to a high wage, high skill equilibrium if you have appropriate education policies, particularly actually in the vocational, technical and further education areas where we've done so badly for so long, and actually where over the last 10 years there have been particularly dramatic cuts in funding. Question for Ben Z. I note the point about no return to full-throated austerity. I think that was your phrase. But surely after 10 years of cuts, any more cuts, particularly in local government, would be full-throated austerity. How would you respond to that?
If I were the Treasury, which I am not, but if I were, I would respond by saying that local government spending power will rise over the next few years because there'll be some modest increases in grants, and they will be provided with the ability to raise council tax, which means at least looking a few years ahead, their spending power would increase. So it certainly won't be a return to the deep cuts to grants that we saw in the early 2010s. That being said, it is certainly true that even a very modest cut to an area like local government could prove challenging, particularly given the pressures that they're under. But I think that our central scenario based on our modelling suggests that those departments between them could be facing a cut of about £2 billion as unprotected budgets. Now, £2 billion isn't that much. The point here is that it wouldn't take huge sums for the Chancellor to potentially ease some of these pressures. So Isabel talked about improvements in the borrowing outlook this year of more than £50 billion, and that's expected to persist. To some extent, we might see an improvement of ballpark £20 billion. So it wouldn't take the Chancellor to take all of that windfall and spend it all on public services to alleviate those pressures. It might require a few £1 billion here and there, could really go a long way. And that's very true of something like courts, where we know they're facing some really acute challenges and shortages and difficulties, but the budget's just not that big, and it wouldn't actually cost that much to help get courts functioning again. So I think that the message I'd take away is that yes, these current plans do look tight and they do look challenging, but it wouldn't take too much for the Chancellor to be able to, you know, soften the edges a bit and make them a bit more palatable.
I think that last point that Ben makes is really important when thinking about what we've been saying. I mean, what happened over the 2010s often was it was these relatively smaller budgets, though local government is a pretty big one, which ended up sort of at the end of the queue after the money that was needed for health and schools and so on was been allocated, and then a few billion was chopped off these other budgets, and a few billion was worth an awful lot to them, a large fraction of the total. Going the other way, just a small number of billions would actually move the dial a lot on the chart that you saw from Ben, and it's going to be a big choice for the Chancellor, and he will have that choice as to whether he makes those billions available. So, you know, frankly, I think we would not be surprised to find that line that you showed, that Ben showed, which went underneath zero in the next couple of years. I'm pretty sure that the Chancellor, I think there's a good chance that the Chancellor will find a way of ensuring that actually goes up over those years, even if only modestly, because the cost of doing so will be relatively low.
Could I add something, Paul, quickly? Just if any Treasury spending officials are watching, it would be possible to reprofile the Chancellor's spending plan. So the chart I showed you showed that, you know, those areas are facing a cut next year and a difficult 2 years, followed by, at least on the face of it, like a relative plenty in the final year where those budgets are set to increase by more than 8%. It would be possible to reprofile, bring some funding forward so that those budgets don't have to face a cut and they face more modest growth over the full 3 years. And that might make it easier for them to meet some of the pandemic pressures, which will be most acute in the short term. And I should say that it's not just us that have suggested that might be sensible, it's also our friends at the Institute for Government. And that would be a relatively, he needn't spend any more overall, but he could ease some of the challenges facing public services just by shifting money between years. So that might be something that Treasury is thinking about to deal with some of these challenges.
Some questions here about interest rate increases. So for you, Ben, is inflation likely to lead to base rate increases? And if we do get base rate increases, might that be helpful or not for current stagnant growth? And then for Isabel, I think, what will be the impact of small increase in interest rates on the public finances? So Ben first.
Yeah, absolutely. We are expecting, I would say, a moderate increase in interest rates over the next 6 months or so. Well, 12 months, rather, I should say. You know, we're expecting the Bank of England to hike interest rates in February next year, and indeed to hike again in May as well. I think it's important to stress that within that, we're not really expecting the bank to do so, you know, with the aim of trying to slow the recovery. Instead, with sort of CPI now looking like it will peak potentially well above 5% if sort of wholesale energy prices stay where they are. You know, what we have seen in recent weeks is evidence that inflation expectations in the UK are not quite as well behaved as particularly we may have hoped. So we've seen financial market expectations, for example, continue to increase. Households have also shown some tentative signs that they expect inflation not just to be higher over the next 12 months, but indeed in the long term. And the challenge for the Bank of England, of course, is that's a challenge to their inflation sort of fighting mettle, to their credibility. And it's that, we think, which is going to push them potentially to hike interest rates and to try and demonstrate their willingness to do what's necessary to keep inflation, or to ensure inflation ultimately returns back to target. Our thinking is that would, unfortunately, have a moderate adverse impact on the UK economy. You know, there have been a couple of structural changes in the UK that probably mean some of those sensitivities are a little bit less than they might have been previously. For example, for households, the large accumulation of household saving does seem to now mean that their overall sort of debt as a portion of their whole balance sheet is thankfully now a little bit less, and that may mean that increases in interest rates and potential increases in mortgage rates weigh slightly less. But of course, the flip side of that is what's happened on the fiscal side, to which I will defer to the IFS folk. But yeah, our sense is interest rates will rise. They'll rise moderately, and the Bank of England in the process will be trying to signal its willingness to fight inflation. But we certainly don't see this as the start of a genuine rate hiking cycle. Indeed, given the economic outlook I sort of outlined earlier, our expectation is they'll do 50, they'll begin a passive unwind of the balance sheet, but they'll be stuck there for quite some time. And that's just based on our view of the way we expect the UK economy to develop through 2022 and into 2023.
Ben, I think part of the thinking behind the question was we've had effectively zero interest rates for a decade, and some people certainly have argued that that's been one of the reasons that growth has been so low. Is that something that you would agree with or not?
No, not particularly, I don't think. I mean, I do recognise some of those arguments and some of the idea that particularly it may have, at the margin slowed some factors as far as reallocation goes, contributed to certain zombification tendencies, other things like that. What I would say is, for now, it feels to us like many of the arguments as to why, higher interest rates, or, we think of lower interest rates as stimulative still remain. We don't broadly believe that higher interest rates are good, at least from a cyclical economic perspective for now. And indeed, what I would say is, even if interest rates do rise, we share the view of many on the Monetary Policy Committee, it seems, which is long-term equilibrium interest rates, we certainly hope, would be set to remain quite low for quite some time.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Isabel, impact of increasing interest rates on the public finances?
Right, so when we look at the change between the March budget forecast and this most recent forecast that we've produced for the Green Budget, then this increase in interest rates in the short term and persisting towards the end of the forecast, as Ben was explaining, in part this is just happening earlier than we would have expected. So part of this brings forward some costs that eventually we would have had to face anyway. Part of that may also be a genuine increase that we weren't anticipating back in March. And one of the dynamics over the past few years that we've been highlighting in past green budgets is that the public finances are now much more exposed to increases in interest rates than they were. And this is a combination there's a combination of factors driving this. There's, to start very simply, there's the level of debt. When debt is very high, then even a small increase in the interest rate that you pay on that high debt will amount to quite a few billions on that the Chancellor will have to find to finance that. There's also a slightly more subtle dynamic in that a lot of the debt is now funded through quantitative easing. And this both means that it's cheaper at the moment, but it also means that when we do see an increase in the interest rate, it feeds through to the debt interest bill much more quickly. This is because when you have a normal government bond held by an investor and the interest rate rises, then you really only have to worry about that at the end of the duration. So you've got a few years until you have to face that. When it's funded through quantitative easing, it's a different story because the bank can change its interest rates between today and tomorrow, and immediately you face this increase in your debt interest cost. So through these different factors, now even a moderate increase, so really the change we've seen so far is sort of making up for the fall we saw during the pandemic. It's not like we're returning to long-run average interest rates or anything. It's a small increase, but we are very exposed, and that means that even these small increases are really felt in the debt interest bill that the Chancellor faces.
Thank you. Ben Z, given pressures on unprotected current budgets, is there a risk that capital budgets might be cut to free up cash to meet those pressures?
Well, that ties into all sorts of questions around what the Chancellor's fiscal rules are going to be. So part of the reason why we've got quite a relatively tight set of current spending plans and a much more generous, at least by recent standards, set of capital spending plans is that the Chancellor, and indeed his Labour counterpart, said they're willing to borrow to invest, to spend on capital spending, but they're not willing to borrow to fund day-to-day spending, at least in the medium term, in normal times. And so what you've got is potentially this squeeze on unprotected budgets. At the same time, potentially those same departments could see their capital budgets growing quite fast. So, for example, if you take a department that could be involved in some of the levelling up or net zero transition, so let's say, for example, Department for Transport. Now, the Department for Transport is one of those unprotected budgets. Their day-to-day, their resource budget could be facing a squeeze. At the same time, I would be amazed if they weren't seeing a huge increase in their capital budget to pay for, big flagship transport projects or to help get us towards electric vehicles, that sort of thing. So there's sort of two stories going on. Now, the question was, could we see capital budgets cut to increase day-to-day spending? Now, you might, but that would take the Chancellor further away, all else being equal, from meeting his current budget balance target. And I think there's sort of a bigger question here, which is it a desirable state of affairs where we've got lots of money sloshing around for capital projects, not all of which will have high rates of return, whereas current spending projects that might have much greater economic returns, so think about, for example, a catch-up programme for schools could, if it deals with those effects of lost learning, could have huge economic returns running into the many billions over the longer term. Or you might think that education and skills more generally perhaps are investments in the future that might pay dividends. And is it desirable that we've got this sort of sharp split? Well, if you want to read about that in detail, we talk about that in the chapter, and other people talk about this. The short answer is it's difficult to see where you draw the line, and the accounting distinction is a useful one, if not a perfect one, and so the Chancellor might want to think about being more creative there, but for the moment that doesn't seem too likely. But yes, the question, whoever asked the question is right, that there is a strange dynamic going on. Then you might see potentially some departments try to move funding from their capital budget into their resource budget if the Treasury permits them, but I would be surprised if they did.
There's quite a few, well, there's 3 or 4 questions here about transition to net zero, which I will sort of just say a couple of words about. What are the risks to the public finances? Well, we don't know still how much of that transition is going to be funded publicly and how much of it's going to be funded privately, but the overall cost in additional capital spending over the next 30 years is certainly going to be in excess of £1 trillion. So it's a large amount of money, but the majority of that is expected to come from the private sector. So but there will certainly be in the tens of billions of pounds impact on capital spending from the public sector over that period. The biggest risk to the public finances, though, almost certainly comes from the loss of fuel duty. So if we're going to get to zero emissions cars, we're going to lose 30 billion or so of the tax revenues we currently get from taxing petrol and diesel. Now, one hopes that at some point the government will bite the bullet and start taxing either the use of roads or perhaps the use of electricity that goes into electric cars. I think they're going to be quite reluctant to do that at the moment as they try to persuade people to go for electric cars, but already we are at or close to the point where the lifetime cost of electric cars, because of the lack of fuel duty, is at or below that of conventional cars. So there's clearly a risk on the fuel duty side. It's also a question about where spending for net zero might come from, capital or current budgets, and what departments. Well, most of it, I think, will be from capital budgets. Some of it will be it'll be spread to some extent across a number of departments. Obviously, the big investment so far has been in green electricity. That's effectively come from the private sector, though it's been funded through taxes on electricity consumption. Big transport infrastructure will clearly come from the Department for Transport, but probably the biggest capital investment the government, or through the private sector perhaps, will have to make will be on converting homes at some point to use something other than gas to heat their homes. So there are lots of elements, and it will be a complex move to net zero. So talking of complex, there's a really interesting question here. Ben Nabarro, I'm going to ask you initially, but if others have thoughts, I'd certainly be interested. If we're going to get a permanently larger state, what's the implications for the private sector?
It's a very good question. Depends on the composition of the state, right? Yeah, that's probably not a satisfactory answer. No, I mean, it's a very interesting development. I mean, especially reading the chapters from IFS, it's hard to avoid that conclusion, especially in the longer term. And of course, you know, while the UK state is not necessarily large in cross-national comparison as yet, and even on these metrics, it doesn't look like it will be. It's of course quite a different picture when you compare historically, especially when you include the sort of what actually the state is consisting of, right? Like even when the state was larger, it included a range of public corporations, for example, which clearly now sit within the private sector. So it's a very different state in that respect. I mean, for the private sector, it's interesting. I mean, I think I'd say two things. The first is it really highlights the importance of the question IFS have been grappling with for a long, long time, which is if you imagine, you know, you have to fund this state, you have to fund it via taxing, then the efficiency of your tax system becomes a more and more important question. And I think, you know, one of the things that gives me long-term structural concern is the seeming, I may be corrected by IFS folk on this, but the seeming lack of seriousness, especially in recent years, with which the UK has tackled the questions of its tax base and its seeming unwillingness to engage in more fundamental questions or sweeping questions of tax reform. You know, just this morning, for example, you know, hearing again about how council taxes are based on property valuations in 1991, you know, if you imagine that sort of inefficiency is governing a larger and larger part of your economic activity, then clearly that becomes a bigger and bigger problem. The other thing I'd say, and this is true more from a monetary policy perspective than otherwise, is, you know, one of the things we've seen through this pandemic is monetary and fiscal policy complementing each other quite closely. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Indeed, you'd think it's deeply welcome in economic circumstances like the pandemic. But what it does mean is if the state is going to get structurally larger, you know, the sort of region or the scale of the economy that's sensitive to interest rates in a private sector context is, of course, also becoming proportionately smaller. You know, this question of how monetary and fiscal policy should complement or even potentially coordinate at times in very specific circumstances, you know, I think that becomes more and more poignant. So I think those would be my two takeaways. It makes the tax question more important from an macroeconomic perspective, and it means this question of how, if at all, monetary and fiscal policy should coordinate is also a more important structural question going forward, as well as just a cyclical one.
And Isabel, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things.
Good.
So, first thing is just a fairly simple, obvious point. There are lots of countries, particularly in Western Europe, that have much larger tax takes than we do, and they often run successful, thriving, market-based economies. And so it's clearly possible to have more tax and also a successful private sector. Second thing I'd say is that if we do want to move towards a bigger state, we do want to raise more in taxes, it's useful again to use that international comparisons to say, okay, other countries do raise more than we do, and what are the ways in which they raise more or less than the UK? So the area where the UK really stands out is the average earner in the UK, so sort of not the very top earners, but sort of those on sort of middle incomes, pay a lot less in the UK than they do in lots of other comparative countries, and that's particularly due to differences in like social security contributions. So the recent health and social care levy gets us a bit more towards where, you know, other countries are. And if that sort of continues, if governments faced by these pressures find that the easiest lever to pull, which I strongly suspect they will, we might see that trend continue. And that means for the private sector, you're going to have potentially employers with larger taxes on jobs, if you want to call employer national insurance contributions that. They're going to have employees with perhaps lower take-home pay. That obviously will factor in then to decisions they make about the size of their labour force, wage offers, and so on. So it clearly will feed into the private sector in lots of important ways.
And I think it's particular. Isabel, sorry.
If I may. I think it's sort of piggybacking a little bit on what the two Bens have said. There's also an argument for considering this more in the design of our fiscal rules. So if we think that really this is the way we're heading for a growing size of the state because of inescapable pressures from rising healthcare costs and ageing, and if we are not willing to consider just not addressing these pressures and just leaving them there to do what they may, then we might think about something that actually the UK has one successful example of with pensions. So Paul has mentioned that many other countries are facing a bigger problem on pensions because the UK has set a fairly smart default in that the state pension age adjusts automatically, and so you don't have to wait for a government to do the unpopular thing and to raise the state pension age. You've set a good default. And there's some debate, especially in the US, but also in the UK, about whether we can think about other areas of fiscal policy where we can think more about the defaults we set and how we can link expenditure to its underlying drivers such that we can fund programs on a more sustainable basis and we don't have to wait until they're really at crisis point for policy to intervene and to then give that funding boost and to be stuck in that sort of cycle. So I think that's a promising area for further thinking to make that more specific.
Great, thank you. I mean, the one thing I would add, and actually someone has made this point on Slido, is that clearly the efficiency with which we spend as well as the efficiency with which we tax is going to be terribly important as the state becomes bigger. Both the efficiency within something like the NHS, which where outcomes, at least given our spending, are not particularly great, but also efficiency when we're thinking about are we doing the right thing, especially in terms of education and infrastructure and similar. Ben Nabarro, more questions for you about supply chains. I mean, there's
Yes.
one here which is that you said that you expect global supply chain pressures to dissipate over 2022. What are the downside risks and what indicators are you watching? And there's also a question which is related, which is to what extent are the supply chain issues laid to do with Brexit, and to what extent are they separate from Brexit?
Yeah, both very good questions. I mean, the truth is on the supply chain question, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Our conditioning assumption, for what it's worth, is that after the Chinese New Year in particular, we'd expect the sort of global freight market to begin to normalise. And I use that very tentatively because one of the implications of what we've seen so far with extraordinarily high freight rates is there's a lot of economic activity, trade flows of sort of lower value goods that have been sat on the sidelines. There's a lot of sort of demand inventory to still work through the system, essentially. So those prices we think will hopefully begin to come down at that stage, but they will only do so slowly. And that also speaks to the sort of global pressures on supply chains. We know, for example, in the UK that inventories are at record lows, and those will have to be restocked, and that sort of extends the process or extends the period of disruption and slightly higher prices potentially. It won't come down very, very quickly, or certainly not at the same rate it went up. So, these things are going to take some time, some years to work through. The downside risks to that in the near term are that, in essence, one of the ways you could think about vaccination coverage globally is many of those areas that particularly supply the world's consumer goods don't have quite as good coverage as those areas that demand them. Now that of course poses the risk as we go into yet another winter that we see more of what we saw, the genesis of all of these problems going back to the start of 2020, which is closures at important ports in important industrial areas, all of which act to compound the pressures we've already seen. And the issue with supply chains, of course, is that these things compound one another, they don't just add. If you have another round of closures, a load more shipping containers end up in the wrong place, and you end up in a much, much worse situation than you were if these just sort of added to each other in a slightly more benign way. So there are certainly big risks. We'd expect the prices here to come off gradually through 2022. And yeah, I think it's worth looking very, very closely at freight rates, at COVID rates in countries that we know are key sort of semiconductor producers, key consumer goods producers, South Korea, various regions of China, Indonesia, Vietnam. All of these will be, I think, very important factors. With respect to, we sort of think, but we gradually do think these pressures should dissipate. I do think one of the structural implications of that is a move we're seeing away from just-in-time and efficiency towards resilience. And that does imply a structural change in the productivity level in many of these parts of the economy and a subsequent change in relative prices. And that, I think, will now be with us for some time. The Brexit question, Brexit has certainly been playing a role. You can see that in the ONS BICS data, where most firms attribute disruption to both Brexit and COVID, not just one or the other. So I think it has been playing an impact, having an impact at the start of this year. I think it will take quite some time for that to come through. The UK hasn't really started imposing its import checks yet. I think it will be very interesting to see the effect that has as we go into next year and indeed into the years beyond.
Great, thank you. I think we'll draw this to a close in a moment. There's a couple of questions here about tax, which we're always keen to take. I mean, there's one comment saying, talking about tax, we are already taxed enough as it is, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. I won't comment on that. But the talking about council tax property bans, how would you go about revaluing is the question. If you revalued against current prices nationally, you would dramatically hurt families in the southeast. That is absolutely true. And once you've had 30 years now of drift, changing things becomes ever more difficult, and so you would clearly need to make a change gradually. You'd have to have all sorts of transitional protections, and the questioner is absolutely right. The longer you leave this, the more difficult it becomes. But that is actually a reason for action rather than a reason for inaction. But gradual action is certainly the order of the day. There's actually, if you read the local government chapter of the Green Budget, which we published last week, there's an analogous issue there with the funding of local authorities. The formulae on the basis of which funds are distributed haven't been changed since the early 2000s, and even the data on population sizes and age distributions haven't changed since 2013. So we're still funding councils as if their relative population sizes were the same as they were 8 years ago. And for example, the population of Tower Hamlets in London has increased by 20% in that period, whilst the population of Blackpool has fallen by 2%. The number of pensioners in Hart in Hampshire, or numbers of people over 80 in Hart in Hampshire, has increased by more than a quarter. The number of people over 80 in Barking and Dagenham has fallen by something like 15%, and yet we're still funding these councils as though none of that had happened. And that means as we move to a more rational system, there will be big winners and losers, and there'll have to be a long period of transition. Where we are both with council tax and with the funding of local government is neither efficient nor equitable, and that is because policy has drifted for so long, and the longer it drifts, the harder it is to change, but the more urgent it is to change. I will have a quick shifty through the questions here to see if there's any final ones which we should... someone's correcting someone else's spelling, which I like to see. Isabel, the golden rule on the current budget was first set back in the late 1990s. So this is the idea that we should be aiming for current budget balance. To what extent is this still useful when we're thinking about 2021?
Well, the successive IFS Green Budgets have advocated for something like that rule, for a forward-looking current budget rule. And some of the principles behind it are very much still valid. So this kind of rule aims to pay for current day-to-day spending out of current revenues. And Ben has mentioned before that the accounting distinction between current and capital is far from perfect. Certainly there are some kinds of current spending that have long-term returns, such as early childhood education, for example. And there are some kinds of capital spending that probably don't have very high returns at all. But nevertheless, this is a clear distinction, one that's not easily gameable, that's based on international accounting rules, and that somehow proxies for this distinction between each generation paying for itself and sharing the burden of funding things that have more long-term benefits. So there are certainly still advantages to it. That said, no fiscal rule is perfect. No fiscal rule on its own can substitute for good policy making, for good scrutiny, as Paul has mentioned. So I think it's a question of seeing the benefits of a well-designed fiscal rule that balances flexibility with transparency and with ease of communication, while also accepting that fiscal rules can't do everything.
Great. I would add that the original golden rule of the late 1990s, early 2000s was actually backward-looking in the sense that the current budget balance was supposed to balance over the cycle in which it was taken, and Chancellor Brown at the time decided to change the cycle, or his measurement of the cycle, rather than change his policy in order to meet his rule. So forward-looking is certainly better than something along those lines. There's a question here. I don't know whether it's for Isabel or one, or it could be either. Any of the three of you. If the Bank of England just refunds any interest on QE to the government, do bank rate rises really have a material effect on the public finances? Stunned silence.
Didn't you cover this earlier, Isabel? Isn't the fact that the refund is the difference between bank rate and the
gilt rate?
The gilt rate, exactly. So if the bank rate changes, the value of the refund changes, in which case then yes, it will feed through the public finances.
The answer is yes, it will. Right. Okay. Are there any other? There's more questions about interest rates, which I think you'll give the same answer to you have before, Ben. Question about net zero, which we've covered. Questions about budget deficit's effect on GDP. I think we'll stop there, actually. We are at pretty much 11:15. We've been going with questions for 45 minutes, which I think is probably enough both for the audience and for my colleagues. I'm ever so sorry that we didn't get to see Christian Schulz present on the international global economy. His chapter and indeed his slides will be available on the IFS website, and in the end I think both in what he said and in some of the questions he answered, Ben Nabarro covered at least some of that material. Thank you so much to my colleagues, thank you to Citi and thank you to Nuffield for working with us and supporting us on this. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and of course do look out for our analysis of the budget, where the budget will be 2 weeks tomorrow, and we will be presenting on our analysis of it on the day after, as usual. So thank you all for joining us from wherever you are, and I sincerely hope that this time next year we will be speaking to at least some of you in person. Thank you.